I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, and today we have with us Tom Standage. He's the Deputy Editor of The Economist and editor of The World In, and of course this year, The World in 2021. The World Affairs Council's Chat with the Editor of The World has been a council favorite for a number of years. We talked with Tom's predecessor, Daniel Franklin, in the past, and today we're delighted that Tom could join us. He's been the editor for the last 2 years. An annual feature for subscribers, The Economist gathers its team of journalists, experts, and global leaders to forecast events and trends that may shape the year ahead. And showing the newspaper's objectivity, there's even an essay where they evaluate the success of their prognostications. I want to be sure to thank our sponsor today, and that's PNC Bank, as well as our promotional partners, the Institute for Global Engagement at Dallas Baptist University, and the University of Texas at Dallas, Naveen Jindal School of Management. And we always are pleased to have the support of the World Affairs Councils of America. And today I want to spotlight two councils, the International Relations Council of Kansas City and the World Affairs Council of Jacksonville. You can keep up with the programs of our council, the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, by going to our website at dfwworld.org, or I hope that you'll subscribe to our YouTube channel, DFW World, as well. You know, I'm not going to give a long introduction for Tom Standage because I think how someone gets to The Economist is so interesting. But before we bring Tom into the conversation, I do want to remind you that you can ask questions to Tom and just go ahead and put it into your Q&A box, and we'll just roll in as many of those as we possibly can. So Tom, in addition to his role as deputy editor of The Economist and editor of the yearly The World In, he's also the magazine's digital strategy editor and responsible for that, and also the development of products such as espresso and Economist films. You know, I first met you, Tom, when I learned about that wonderful book that you wrote, History of the World in 6 Glasses. Which was a New York Times bestseller, as well as your other book that was a New York Times bestseller, An Edible History of Humanity. Clearly, that's an interest of yours. So great to have you with us.
Great, thank you. Great to be here.
Tom, I know you graduated from Oxford and what, a degree in, what was it, engineering or in computing?
Well, back in the day, it was the 1980s, the late 80s, you couldn't do computer science at Oxford. You had to do it with engineering or maths, so I did it with engineering. You can now do it, but in true Oxford style, they don't call it computer science, they call it computation.
So how did you end up, I mean, when you were doing that, I suspect that being a journalist was probably not at the top of your list.
Funnily enough, I spent a lot of time at university playing the drums and also working on the student papers, but as a photographer, not as a writer. And while I was waiting for my films to dry, I would type up people's copy because I was a very fast typist, just because I'm a programmer as well. And I would then find myself saying, well, you realize that's not actually how that's not, there's a mistake in this sentence. And I would end up subbing their copy as well. But I wasn't actually doing much journalism. I wrote a couple of pieces. What really happened was that and that sort of stuff. I'd read lots of science fiction as a teenager, and I still read lots of science fiction. And I was very disappointed when I got to university to discover that AI didn't work. And looking back on it, I was studying it just at the point of what is now called an AI winter. And it was only a couple of years later that the beginning of the work was done that has sort of led to the explosion of machine learning and deep learning that we've seen in the past sort of decade. But that was just, that sort of is traced back to some work that was done right at the beginning of the 1990s. The upshot was I finished my degree and they thought to do. That career really didn't
issue, I think, with your audio. If you could speak a little slower, I think it might be helpful.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Well, anyway, it turned out that I couldn't do AI, and then the internet came along. And as someone who had done computer science and used the internet as part of that, I knew about it. And it turned out that none of the British newspapers had anyone who knew about the internet. So I sort of fell into journalism at that point, and the internet and writing about technology was my ticket into journalism.
So you ended up, you went to The Guardian, and how long were you there? And tell us about how you ended up at
I was there for a year, and I was I was there for a year, and one of the things, as well as writing articles there, I built the first website for The Guardian as well. So I really was combining the writing of code with the writing of articles. And then I spent 2 years at the Daily Telegraph, and then I went to The Economist in 1998. And I spent 2 years there initially as science correspondent, and my engineering degree in that context, because the engineering you do at Oxford is basically a lot of physical sciences. So I was able to write about microprocessors and space probes and computer viruses and so on. So, and then since then, I've done a variety of jobs on the sort of business, and I've sort of broadened my portfolio since then, in the sort of following 20 years.
Is it typical for The Economist to hire people who do not have, say, degrees in journalism or?
Yes, it is, and I have to say it's typical of the British media in general. So very few people, in my experience, or people cohort have studied journalism formally. I know it's absolutely standard in America that you do a degree and then you go to Columbia or whatever, and but in Britain we don't have the idea. I don't think that journalism is a profession. I think we are less starry-eyed about how this is a profession, and we kind of think that it's a craft and that you can learn it, and having people who have experience in academia or business or whatever, or government, and the you can probably teach them to write if they have interesting ideas. So yes, we aren't we don't sort of say, where's your degree from from journalism school. So I think that's more of a transatlantic difference than The Economist per se.
So one of the things that I always enjoy about reading The World In is I can finally match and figure out who is Lexington and who are some of the other weekly op-ed authors that I enjoy so much. Tell us about the background about why The Economist typically, at least in the weekly magazine, does not provide the bylines.
Well, if you look back at newspapers in the 19th century, not having bylines was in fact the norm. And what's happened since then is that bylines have become more widespread. So we just didn't adopt that approach. And part of the reason is that we've always written in this tone of voice that appears to come from a single person, the voice of The Economist. And now initially, funnily enough, the founder of The Economist, James Wilson, wrote most of the articles. So he used anonymity to cover up the fact that one person was writing everything. And we now use anonymity, which is to make it sound as though many people is, but the idea is that you get this consistency of tone, and that we agree with each other, not just what we say on page 13 agrees with what we say on page 65, but that what we say this week will agree with what we say next week and next month. And if we do change our minds, we'll say so. So we're trying to present a consistent view of things, and that consistency comes through a lot of editing, a lot of debate internally, and not having bylines. So yes, this is very unusual that in the annual, in the world, you can see that when a column is written by James Astill, who is the current Lexington columnist, you can see not just the word Lexington, which was what you would see in the weekly, but you can see the name of the current holder of that title.
So it must have been, and this has happened in past years as well, but it had to be a challenge to publish The World In, I guess, on schedule, with the pandemic and, of course, the U.S. Presidential election. Well,
The Economist, I mean, journalists, I think, are very, very lucky, because journalism is one of those things that you can do remotely. And, a lot of journalists do work, they travel around and expected to file copy wherever they are and so on. So switching to working remotely rather than in an office was less of a wrench for us than I think for a lot of other professions. The other thing we should remember, of course, is that less than half of people overall, even in the richest, able to work. It depends how you define it. And at best, it's only about half. So those of us who are able to work remotely, need to avoid making the mistake that we are representative. We are not. We are a privileged few who are able to do this. Anyway, you're right. It was we had to switch to producing the paper and producing The World In remotely. So that was a shift. But I don't think that was the big challenge. The big challenge was really, yes, you've got the uncertainty. When you're talking about 2021, you've got the uncertainty around the pandemic and what will happen there. You've got the resulting uncertainty about the economics and what happens with the recovery. And then you've got this geopolitical uncertainty. And so, you know, the schedule of the world in when there's a US presidential election, it's always a nightmare because we only have a couple of days after the election to you know, to send everything off to press. And this year we arranged for another week so that we were expecting the result not to be available straight away. And fortunately, you know, there was a pretty clear result within a few days. And so we were able to go to press with, you know, not having to fudge it like we did in 2000, where there was no result until, you know, the middle of December or something. And so if you go back and look at the world in 2001, there's an awful lot of fudge being applied because it went to press when we didn't know whether Bush or Gore would end up in the White House.
Right. Of course, the current occupant of the White House might not agree with you.
Unfortunately, nobody else seems to agree with him on that. So,
I want to remind everyone that you can ask questions. And before we go to Tom's top 10, let me bring into the conversation Robert Rendell. He asks, are any changes planned in 2021 to the newspaper?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, we're investing a lot in our technology and in our digital journalism at the moment. We've just this week, you know, updated the back end system. I know this is terribly boring, but it's terribly important. When people use websites and apps, they expect them to be the customer service to be and the user experience to be as good as Netflix and as good as Amazon. I mean, these are companies that really know how to do this stuff. And a lot of newspaper publishers, shall we say, are not in that league. And I you know, sorry to say, The Economist has been one of those publishers. It was fiddly to get access to the website. If you were a subscriber, you had to type in a code from the envelope that the magazine came in, you know, all this sort of stuff. And you know, I've had the same experience with other publications too. So we've really been focusing on improving that, and we've also been focusing on increasing the metabolism of our journalism. But the thing about what we're trying to do each week is look on a day-to-day basis in our digital journalism too. We're trying to sort of look at what's going on a global level. So we're not sort of saying, well, people are more interested in the US, so we're going to increase the proportion of our content that is about US politics, say. You know, we're essentially always trying to give you the view from the moon. What's the most important stuff that's going on in the world? So we're continuing to do that, and our mission in that respect has not changed. So we're trying to do that better on a better metabolism, and with with better data visualization and basically better technology, so that it's a more pleasant reading experience.
Well, let's don't hold people in suspense any longer. Let's go to your top 10. And again, I suspect that your top 10 are going to raise a lot of questions. So send them on in, folks.
Sure. Okay. So this is my top 10 essentially plundered from the pages of the World In. And so, as we've discussed, we make the World In. It comes out every November. We also have another annual called the World If, which comes out in July, and that's a sort of sci-fi scenarios edition where the articles are sort of articles that have fallen through a crack in the space-time continuum from future editions of The Economist. So we looked at climate change this year, and we had pieces that were set in the year 2020 all the way up to the year 2050 on various different climate pathways. And the other picture there is the cover I did in 2012 on AI and the ethics of AI, where I predicted that this would become an important issue in the years to come, which I think has been validated. So the point is that, you know, one of the hats I wear at The Economist is to be the sort of unofficial department of futurology. So in practice, that means I have to edit the World In, and I have to write this letter that at the beginning where I summarize the most important trends, and that's what I'm going to give you now. The most important trends plundered from the insights and the predictions of my colleagues and our expert external contributors as well. Number one, so obviously the biggest thing happening in 2021 is what happens with the pandemic, and to what extent can we get on top of it quickly with vaccines and so on. We're starting to, you know, already we're seeing debates about which countries get the vaccine, which countries approve it, even in countries where it has been approved, like in Britain, where vaccinations have started this week. There's already, you know, an argument about who's at the front of the queue. And, you know, do you vaccinate just the old people, the over 80s? Do you vaccinate the care home workers at the same time? Where are the health workers in relation to the care home work? You know, these sorts of debates are already happening. The other thing is that people are already now making noises about the fact that Britain, America, and a few other rich countries have overordered on the vaccines to ensure that their populations get covered. But what about the the less fortunate countries, the poorer countries. And there is this scheme called COVAX, which is supposed to ensure safe distribution of vaccines to the poorer countries, starting with a 3% coverage goal for the most vulnerable populations, the frontline health workers and so on. But that scheme needs more money. So I think we're going to see more and more political arguments about this. And the other thing we're going to see is people seem to be assuming at the moment that the vaccine is a silver bullet and that we can very quickly sort of go back to normal. And I think people are being very over optimistic about that, just because they are underestimating the logistical complexity of manufacturing and distributing these vaccines. The Pfizer one needs to be kept at -70. It comes in batches of 975. Once you can only move it 4 times. Once you've opened it, you have to use all of the doses in 3.5 days. Then you have to get the same 975 people back again 21 days later for the second dose. This is logistically complicated stuff. So the idea that everything's going to be back to normal by Easter, which is what British government ministers have been suggested, is, I think, very optimistic. And already, you'll have seen reports in the US that there's only enough, there aren't that many doses of the Pfizer vaccine. The Trump administration said no to a second batch. And so Pfizer's not going to be able to supply any more to the US until June or July. Now, there are other candidates, of course, but all I'm saying is this is going to be a much bumpier ride than people think it is. And, if we're lucky, we'll feel like we've turned the corner by the end of 2021, but this is not going to be a flick a switch and we're all back to normal. That takes us to our next trend, which is what happens with the recovery. And the economic recovery, of course, depends to a great extent on how quickly vaccines can be distributed and how quickly companies can reopen and the constraints that they're operating under now go away. And so you've got these interconnected sources of uncertainty. Our economics editor, Henry Kerr, he says that 2021 is one of the most uncertain years to look at the global economic outlook in living memory, because you've just got this enormous uncertainty around a completely external factor, which is the pandemic and the vaccine. So expect a very bumpy and uneven next few months. We're going to see sort of more of these lockdowns that are turned up and turned down, and different industries affected in different ways, and different countries affected in different ways, and so on and so on. That makes it extremely hard to see where we're going. The other important thing that's happening here, of course, is that we haven't really seen the full economic damage done by the pandemic in many countries, because in many countries, governments have been propping up companies and paying these furlough schemes and so on to keep companies going. In many cases, when they stop doing that, it's going to turn out that those companies are no longer financially viable. So things like high street retailers, sandwich shops, aircraft manufacturers, they're seeing much lower demand now. There are lots of areas where the true level of demand in the post-pandemic world is going to be a lot lower. And so that's going to, suddenly that veil is going to be pulled back, and we're going to see the full extent of the economic damage. And that will only become apparent in 2021 as well. So more uncertainty there. And then the third factor is this, the shift in geopolitics. So in 2021, we'll have had 3 recent changes in the largest 4 economies in the world. So obviously we've got a new president in the US. We're going to get a new chancellor in Germany towards the end of 2021. And we've recently had a change of prime minister in Japan. And Mr. Suga will be trying to keep his job during 2021 as well. He's sort of elected as a caretaker, but he seems to be popular and he does want to hang on to the top job. So that does suggest, obviously, Xi Jinping isn't going anywhere, but that is a sort of a lot of change at the top. And obviously, we've seen under Donald Trump in the past few years, we have seen essentially an undermining of the rules-based post-war international order. A lot of the institutions that we've been used to setting the rules around the world, he's taken a wrecking ball to. So most obviously, paralyzing the WTO, pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, the TPP, and so on and so on. I mean, the World Health Organization. So one big question is, to what extent can Joe Biden put Humpty Dumpty back together again? And I use that expression deliberately because putting an egg back together again obviously isn't really possible. There are some things Joe Biden can do straight away, like go back into the Paris Climate Agreement and the WHO, but there are other things that will be harder. Rebooting the Iran nuclear deal would be a lot more difficult. And I think just in the same way that we're not going to flick a switch and go back to normal, the world as it was with the pandemic and the vaccine, we're not going to flick a switch in geopolitics either and go back to a pre-Trump world. That world is gone, and we're going to be having to adjust to and get used to a new normal. there's going to be obviously big changes in attitudes to things like climate change. But I think one area where there's going to be more continuity than people might expect is in US-China relations. So I think Joe Biden will essentially pursue a very similar sort of approach to China, but I think he will execute it much more competently. In particular, if you want to take on China and you know, put pressure on them on human rights, put pressure on them to open up their economy in the way that Western countries open up their economies to Chinese companies, and if you're arguing, as you know many people do, that China is not playing fair in that regard, then surely the best way for Western powers to do that is to act together. And that's exactly what America hasn't been doing under Donald Trump. As well as picking a trade war with China, he obviously picked another one with the EU and also picked fights with Canada and Mexico and so forth. So I think we can expect under Joe Biden, who is sort of inherently a coalition builder, we can expect him to mend fences with America's traditional allies in order to present a more united front against China. So those tariffs aren't going away. He's going to want to use them for leverage. He's going to want to push China much harder than Donald Trump ever did on things like human rights. So US-China tensions are not going to abate under this scenario. And we've called this a new kind of Cold War. It's very interesting because the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West didn't involve any trade to speak of between the two sides. And of course, that's very different from the situation if you call this a Cold War now, because the economies of China and the West are, you know, intertwined. Just think of things like your iPhone, where you know, it's made in China, it's designed in California, the screen, you know, may come from South Korea, the camera comes from Japan, and so on and so on. It's very difficult to engage in a sort of geopolitical tussle with someone you depend on economically. So in that respect, it's a new kind of Cold War. Another area where I think we're going to see continuing tension is we've seen countries being asked to sort of take sides between the US and China as we move towards a more bipolar world, and we've seen companies caught in that as well. So most famously Huawei, but also more recently TikTok and so on. And you know, all sorts of companies and industries have been caught up in the trade war. You know, Donald Trump had a go at Harley Davidson. The French said they were going to tax American tech giants, so America put like they put import tariffs on French wine. So, you know, this sort of politicization of business decisions seems to be something that we're going to see more of. And the other thing is that CEOs have been expected to step up in the past few years a lot more because of a perceived lack of leadership from political leaders and a loss of trust in political leaders. And they're not seen to be doing enough on things like climate change, racial justice, and so forth. And so people have been putting pressure on CEOs to make pledges on those things instead and try and get change to come about that way. And that means that CEOs have had to be politicians, and some of them are better at that than others, clearly. But we're going to, I don't think that phenomenon is going to go away either. This idea that companies have to take stands on things and their customers and their employees will expect them to do so is something we're going to continue to see. Next, what I'm calling tech acceleration. So we've seen a rapid adoption of lots of technological behaviors as a result of the pandemic. If you look at areas like mobile payments, working from home, studying online, telemedicine, there have been forecasts of how much people would be doing all of these things in the future. And you know, you can ask McKinsey or PwC or whoever. And what we've seen is that in many of those areas, entire countries have jumped forward by several years in the level of adoption. So typically, you know, 5 years of e-commerce adoption, 10 years in some countries like Italy that were really behind on e-commerce. And so in a sense, we're coming out of the, you know, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccines. But when we come out of the tunnel, we're going to be in a different world. We're not going to be in 2021. We're going to be in 2025 or maybe even 2030 in some respects. The big question for 2021 and for the years that follow is to what extent will these new behaviors stick and to what extent will they snap back? And the answer is that there is no single answer. It will vary enormously by industry and it will vary enormously by country. So some countries are just culturally happier with allowing people to work from home, and some industries are happier. So financial services and journalism and technology, for example, they're all areas where working from home, that's pretty cool. Other areas less so, or it's not possible. And then you have these differences between countries. So the idea that, you know, people can work from home, American companies are quite relaxed about that. Chinese companies tend not to be. If you look at surveys, Chinese bosses say that they are much likely, you know, only 4% of them say that they're happier with letting people work from home 2 or 3 days a week in the coming year. So so there isn't going to be a single answer. And this is just to show you this very quickly. This is a chart from McKinsey that shows you a whole bunch of activities down the left-hand side and a whole load of countries across the top. And it shows you the extent to which people have been doing these things more than they were doing them before. So the bluer the blob, the more people in that country have been doing that thing. So you can see, for example, there's been a lot more online streaming in India, and there's been a lot more restaurant delivery in South Korea. And so one of the questions is, how much of this sticks? Clearly, we don't go back to what we were doing before, but nor do we keep on doing what we've been doing in 2020. So we're going to end up somewhere in the middle. And that means that the emphasis is going to be for companies on being agile. You're going to have to listen very carefully to what your customers are doing, what they want you to do. You're going to need good analytics, and you're going to have to adjust to this new normal as it emerges in the next few months. Okay, next, clearly we're going to have a less footloose world in 2021 and probably for quite a while after that. Less migration, less tourism, fewer foreign students moving around, which is a very, very big problem for universities whose business model depends on foreign students, which a lot of them do, and less business travel. Bill Gates said a few days ago he thinks that the amount of business travel is going to go down by 50% as a result of the pandemic, is not going to come back. We've seen after previous crises like 9/11 and the global financial crisis, business travel has taken a hit and it's not come back to the level it was at before. So that's what happens at the best of times. Of course, what's happened this time around is that we've all got used to using these tools, and they're really pretty good for some things. So so it's going to be only business travel for the trips that are absolutely vital, for the things where having that personal contact is deemed completely necessary. Also, as companies struggle to recover next year, an obvious thing to cut is going to be their travel budget. So expect a less footloose world. The other thing that's interesting is to look at Airbnb, which is just in the process of going public. Its IPO looked like it had been completely scuppered by the pandemic, but it's completely changed. The behavior of its customers has undergone this astonishing transformation. 80% of bookings on Airbnb now are by people booking in the same country where they live and within 200 miles of their home. And instead of wanting to go to kind of hotspot cities in other countries and stay in an apartment in the middle of Rome or something like that, they want to go and sit in a log cabin sort of in the middle of nowhere, but not too far from where they live. So Airbnb has responded brilliantly to that, and as a result, its IPO, it's actually going to price above its IPO range, its expected price range. So travel's still happening, it's just looking very different from the way it looked before, and I'm not sure it will ever go back to the way it was before. This is also an opportunity for the climate, not because people are flying less. I mean, they are flying less, but actually the fact that we've all been flying less this year hasn't really made that much difference. It's probably going to reduce global emissions by about 8%. And that really, in the grand scheme of things, makes no difference to climate change, because the problem with climate change is that accumulated 200 years of carbon emissions, most of which is still in the atmosphere. But what it does do is it gives policymakers an opportunity, as they build their recovery plans, to make sure that those are green recoveries. So Joe Biden wants this Build Back Better, green stimulus, $2 trillion stimulus if he can win control of the Senate, and a smaller stimulus I think will still happen if he doesn't. The EU stimulus plan has 750 billion euros set aside, of which I think 2/3 is for green stimulus. So clearly, if people aren't going to be going back to working in high street retail, for example, which is going to have taken a big hit as a result of the accelerated shift to online shopping, then can those people go and work in green industries? Can they go and retrofit solar panels onto houses, build wind turbines, etc., etc.? There's going to be an enormous demand for those things, and there's going to be a lot of people who need new jobs. So if you can put those two things together, that gives you an opportunity to really change things. The other thing to watch out for next year is the COP26 conference, which should have happened this year in Britain, will be happening next year instead, and that's where countries are expected to pledge their carbon emission reduction targets for the coming years. China has just upped the ante enormously there by saying it's going to go carbon neutral by 2060. So we have to hope that that will encourage other countries to make similarly bold pledges, because the pledges that have been made so far, if you add them up, do not get us to within 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming. They are not enough to meet the terms of the Paris Agreement. That COP26 event is one of many that will have been postponed from this year. Others include the Olympics, the Dubai Expo, and so on. Amusingly, many of these things that have been held over, which will give next year a sense of déjà vu, I think, particularly because those events have not had their names changed. So the Olympics in 2021 is still going to be called the 2020 Olympics. Dubai Expo is still going to be called Dubai Expo. They've printed the t-shirts, they've made all the mugs, they've got the logos, so they're not going to change them now. And that's going to make next year feel like a sort of strange case of déjà vu. And my final trend is, and we have a section on this in the World In, I think we're going to hear next year from people who are worried about other predictable risks. So there have been people warning about the inevitability of a pandemic for many years, and it's often referred to as disease X. And disease X was the next disease coming along. We didn't know what it would be, but we knew we had to get ready for it. And there were various exercises that had been conducted and readiness plans and so on. And clearly some countries did a better job of preparing for it than others. But there are other things in that category too. Are we paying enough attention to antibiotic resistance, or nuclear proliferation, or bioterrorism, or artificial intelligence going crazy and trying to take over the world? Now, I have to confess, I'm slightly less worried about that one than I am about all the others. The one I'm particularly concerned about is antibiotic resistance, because it takes a long time to produce new antibiotics. And if all the ones we have at the moment stop working, then we need to have started making the replacements 10 years ago. So I think we're going to have a lot of people banging the drum for other predictable threats and saying, while policymakers are sort of saying, well, okay, we dodged a bullet there. We've figured out what to do with the pandemic. We obviously need to prepare for future pandemics a lot better. But what else do we need to prepare for? And so I think that gives these people who are worried about the next catastrophe a brief window. The other thing is that clearly all of the predictions that were made by futurologists and prognosticators, not just at the Economist but elsewhere, for 2020 were completely knocked for six by the pandemic. And so we may see a bit more humility among future gazers for next year. But do I want to make a firm prediction about that? I think that might be a prediction too far. So I will leave it at that and we can go to questions. Thank you.
Great. We do have some questions and welcome others. One of the things that you do in the publication is you have a number of guest writers who write op-ed pieces. And one was Michelle Wooker. And she talked about rhinos versus
Yes.
the Black Swan event. One, tell us how you select the authors that you invite to participate, contribute to the World In, and what is it in our human nature that we just are not looking out for these rhinos?
So yes, she wrote a book called The Grey Rhino, and the idea, she says, is that people worry about black swans, for example, so a rare, unpredictable event that catches you out. And she says, well, climate change or the inevitability of a pandemic, they're not like a black swan at all. You can see them coming, they're coming, and they're heading towards you, and they're really obvious. So they're like a grey rhino. But what tends to happen, yes, is people sort of discount. They want to put it off, and she talks about this in her book. Actually, she says there are lots of things that people sort of put off doing. They know they have to do them, but they just kind of, I don't really feel like. I mean, for example, the classic case is failing to make a will. It's boring. You don't want to do it. It's going to cost you money. It's going to make you have to think about your own demise. So it's one of those things that you kind of put on a list and you never quite get round to doing it. And humanity is very good at doing this, on a larger scale with things like climate change. The other thing, of course, is that politicians are, it's someone else's problem, right? If you're an elected politician today, the consequences of climate change are, they're starting to become apparent. But by the time things, are getting really bad, you're not going to be in office anymore, and it's going to be the people who are in office then who are going to have to deal with it. So there's also a sort of inherent tendency not to worry about long-term problems baked into democracies, because how many people are still going to be around to face the consequences. So yes, there is a problem there, and she writes about that in The Grey Rhino. And I invited her to write for the World In because I wanted to have a section. We always have a special section every year that kind of takes a different perspective or does a new thing. And for this year, the obvious thing to do, and I created a section called Aftershocks. It looks at the lessons and the opportunities from the pandemic. So it tries to find silver linings where there are some, and but there aren't always. So going back to the existential threats and the next catastrophe, for example, there's an academic at Oxford called Tony Ord who's just written a book about that. And he obviously is, you know, everywhere on the media in Britain at the moment, because people are getting him on to say, well, you know, what else should we worry about next? What's the next thing that could completely upend all of our lives? And he'll tell you, he's got several candidates there. And so I asked him, and I asked Michelle Wooker to write about grey rhinos. But I also asked, you know, the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who we tip as a possible candidate for the future president of France. She's very well known for her enthusiasm for bicycles and bike lanes and making Paris a more pleasant city by reallocating space on the streets from cars to people and bicycles. And she talks about how in lockdown, you know, Paris led the way, and many other cities have done the same in basically creating lots of new bike lanes that are now going to be permanent. And so that's the kind of thing, the legacy of the pandemic, that's not necessarily, you know, a bad one. It's a good one, and that's the sort of direction we want to go in. I'd like to think that we've seen sort of peak car and peak enthusiasm for car this year, and that our dependency on cars will go down in future rather than up. I realize it's difficult because people are scared of going on public transport, but I would like to think that that, you know, this has made people reassess whether they need to commute as much, and so on and so on. So yes, I look for kind of people who I think will be interesting, have an interesting perspective. We invite them, and a surprisingly large proportion of them say yes, which is wonderful.
You know, I read Toby Orb's piece, and I think one of the questions is the lack of cooperation by among the international community. There was only, I think, one emergency meeting of the G20.
But that was Keir Starmer. I think Keir Starmer made that point, that so he's the opposition leader here in Britain of the Labour Party, and he said it beggars belief that the G7 only had one emergency phone call about this in March. And if you look at the global financial crisis, you know, there were almost daily at one point calls at the height of the crisis between the leaders of the G7 as they coordinated the bailouts and the market interventions that they were doing. And it's astonishing that we haven't seen anything like that in this case. It has to be said that you know, that's partly a reflection of a gulf of a vacuum at the top. America would normally be leading the way here. One area that's a notable exception to this is the scientific community, which has been an exemplary example of global cooperation and of the value of expertise and the value of evidence. And one of the things I would like to happen, but I'm probably just being a wishful thinking, you know, classical liberal here, but I would like to think that that this whole situation this year shows people the value of global cooperation and of expertise and of facts and of science and of evidence. But I suspect I'm probably being a bit too optimistic on that one.
It won't surprise you that we have a few questions about Brexit. What does the Economist see happening there in 2021?
Well, obviously, everything is literally, you know, on a knife edge. Not literally, it's on a knife edge today. Boris Johnson is meant to be talking to Ursula von der Leyen, who incidentally also writes for the World in 2021. She writes about Europe's power as a convening sort of organization. Europe can get people who won't normally talk to each other, or countries who won't normally talk to each other, to talk to each other. That said, Britain and Europe have not been getting on terribly well with the Brexit negotiations. It looks pretty unlikely that we're going to get a deal now. It's politically convenient for Boris Johnson if there isn't a deal, because when there's chaos in January and the whole of Kent becomes a car park and there's shortages of food and so forth, he can blame the intransigence of the EU. Whereas if he does a deal and then there's all that chaos, then it will look like, you know, well, this Brexit you sold us is terrible. What are you going to do about it? The fact, though, is that even if there is a deal now, it will be so insubstantial that it's not going to be able to prevent large-scale disruption. So I think Brexit is going to be very messy for a few months. Frankly, things are messy now already. There's so much uncertainty about this. The ports are clogged up. Felixstowe, one of our big East Coast ports, is full of containers of PPE. Ships are being sent round to the West Coast in Liverpool to unload, and then stuff is being trucked across the country. There's already shortages of some things. So this is before Brexit's even happened. So Brexit is going to be a mess. This is a terrible time for Britain to be imposing this self-inflicted economic wound on itself, given that, you know, we're in the midst of this pandemic-induced recession as well, and then just, you know, the logistics of getting PPE and vaccines in and out is going to be complicated by this too. So the government is already talking about using the military and using Air Force, you know, air bases to get vaccines across from from continental Europe. The Pfizer ones are made in Belgium. So, that shows you what a mess this is going to be. And the government clearly has not covered itself in glory when it comes to addressing the pandemic. So its ability to deal with these kind of difficult logistical problems clearly isn't very good. So that doesn't bode well for their ability to fix the foul-ups that we're going to see as a result of Brexit. So yeah, that's going to be pretty unpleasant for us in Britain, but it's entirely our own fault.
Indeed, public confidence in Boris Johnson is really awful. I mean, I think he has the lowest popularity of practically any leader. And
I think he's the second most unpopular person in his own cabinet, which is pretty astonishing. Yes.
Can he mount a comeback?
It's dangerous to write Boris off. I worked with him, funnily enough, at the Daily Telegraph when he was a columnist there. And what you see is what you get with Boris. He really is like that. And it was before he dabbled with politics. He'd done his first run for a hopeless seat in Wales, which he failed, and he still had the vote for Boris sign in Welsh in his office, which characteristically had a spelling mistake. It didn't even get the Welsh right. Yeah, I wouldn't write him off because people have written him off before when he resigned earlier on, as foreign secretary and so on, and then came back and became prime minister. But it does look, this is not playing to his strong suit. He's good at campaigning. He's good at selling people things. Actual detail and implementing plans bores him. It's not quite as bad as Donald Trump, but it's a similar sort of problem. Solving difficult problems is not his forte, clearly. And this is a difficult problem. The pandemic is a difficult problem. Brexit is a difficult problem. So there are rumblings that, and he's also, said to still be not operating at full strength, having had COVID himself. So I wouldn't be surprised if he decides next year. I mean, the thing about Boris is he's always wanted to be prime minister, but he wants to have the job of prime minister, not do the job of prime minister, rather like Donald Trump with being president.
That sounds familiar.
Exactly. So, so I think an entirely plausible possibility is that Boris says that, for the good of his health, he's going to retire and go and write more biographies of Churchill or whatever, and let somebody else deal with the mess. I wouldn't be surprised if we had a different prime minister, if not by the end of 2021, then certainly by the end of the year after that. And in fact, we tip a few possible people to keep an eye on in that regard in the pages of the World in 2021. So yes, I think that is.
And who are they?
I'm just trying to think. Well, Michael Gove is the obvious one. So he has this rather difficult history with Boris, where they were big mates in the Brexit campaign, and then Michael Gove stabbed Boris in the back, basically, when the leadership campaign came around the first time. But he's clearly got ambitions there as well. So I think if I had to pick anyone, I'd probably bet on him.
Let me bring in this question from Mohammed Zarabi. He asks, how do you anticipate the skeptics of the first batch of vaccines in Western countries? How will that impact the containment of COVID-19?
It's a very good question, because the number of people who are totally skeptical about vaccination altogether is quite small. It's sort of 5 to 10% of the population at most. What we're seeing with these vaccines is a much larger group of people who are known in the trade as vaccine hesitant. So they may be okay with vaccines the rest of the time, but what they're worried about in this case is that these particular vaccines, because they've been developed so quickly in less than a year, which is astonishing, rather than the usual 6 to 10 years, that maybe corners have been cut and they're not safe. Now, the scientists will tell you that they really have done everything by the book, and the regulators will say that they are not cutting corners on the safety and so on. But I think there is a loss of trust when politicians say, the British politicians are saying, "Oh, we're going to get back to normal by Easter." I mean, Boris was talking about getting back to normal by Christmas earlier this year, which obviously hasn't happened. And when Donald Trump clearly politicizes vaccines and says, "Well, why didn't they have them ready for my in time for the election?" They're obviously politically biased. And then recently he said they're somehow going to get vaccines to every zip code in America within 24 hours. I just don't know how you can't do that. It's just not possible. So the problem is that when you hear about these ridiculous claims being made by politicians, Or actually other people with vested interests, like the bosses of drug companies, even they aren't really the best people to be making these statements. You really want to hear from apolitical scientists who have analyzed the data. You want to see peer-reviewed data published in peer-reviewed journals. You want to be hearing from the head of apolitical medical bodies and medical regulators. And that's a real problem in America, where the CDC has been politicized and where it's very clear that Donald Trump has been putting his thumb on the scales and demanding that this drug be regulated and that drug be regulated and so on. So that means that even when you do have the CDC stepping up and saying, we think this is safe, people are less inclined to believe them. I think we've got slightly less of that problem in the UK, but we still do have that problem, this sort of public communication, the loss of trust in experts and so on. I think things could change, though, because once you get to the point where you can see that lots of people have had the vaccine, that nothing bad has happened. It's not putting 5G chips made by Bill Gates into them or whatever nonsense conspiracy theory you believe. Once you see that it actually lets people go back to doing things they were doing before, I think this could quite easily flip, and people will say, actually, I do want this. And I've let enough other people have had it that I'm not worried about the safety, and I don't want to be left out. Well, other people have got their vaccine passports or whatever, and they're allowed to go to the football game, and I'm not. So I think in practice that's going to be what changes attitudes to this. But yeah, it's very unhelpful to have this skepticism towards vaccines under these circumstances.
Are you seeing the skepticism in the UK? Is it political as it has become here, or is it more economic?
No, it's not a party political. So things, mask wearing is not a party political issue in most other countries, and it's certainly not here. It's not in the most of Europe. There is a political argument which reflects the one in the US about, and essentially, right-wing parties are keener on opening up the economy, let granny die because it will save the stock market. More of that kind of rhetoric that says the cure is worse than the disease. This is all nonsense, by the way. The cure is not worse than the disease if reopening the economy is, if shutting down in order to save people's lives, you basically can't see an economic recovery unless you get on top of the virus. You can't have a kind of just let it, herd immunity, let it rip through the population. We can see that that's just not true. But so we do see an aspect of that argument that you have in the US, where right-wing parties, are more skeptical and want to open sooner. But things like mask wearing and so on have not been politicized to the same extent in this country. People are sensible about wearing masks. If politicians don't wear masks or flout rules, they do get a lot of stick for it. Some of them have been forced to resign and so on. So this sort of you don't have the sense of impunity because the president will just ignore this stuff and spout nonsense. That kind of provides cover to to Republican governors and so on to do the same. You don't see that in Britain. Boris is saying the right things and mostly doing the right things.
Although some Democratic governors have had very fancy meals in California.
Yes, well, that doesn't help either. Exactly. But on the so that's the sort of thing. But they recognise, they're more likely to realise that looks bad, right?
Let me bring David Standage into our conversations. David, he says one of the issues we are seeing around preparing our workforce for the changes that are taking place. Do you think our education systems will need to change to prepare the future workforce, and how well are they going to do it?
Very good question, and very relevant, because I think one of the outcomes of the experiment that we've all had to go through this year with our children's education, it's become very clear that there is a massive variation in the availability of the technology and the broadband connections that you need to allow people to do remote learning, and this is going to widen the inequality in education provision. So that is a tragedy and needs to be addressed. But at the same time, it's also shown that if you do have the technology and you do have the courseware set up and the courses all set up, that this can in fact work very well. So the schools that have done it well, those pupils have an even bigger advantage than they have over the students at the schools that haven't done this well, who tend to be the poorer students. So what I hope will happen is that this will destigmatize the idea of online education. And that could be very interesting because provided we can get the technology right and we can improve access to the technology, that could democratize access to better education for a lot of people. So you could, for example, see more people doing university courses online, we could see, essentially global competition between the biggest university brands. And you could also see, more people at work recognizing the value of upskilling and reskilling through online courses. And they may, I think, be less likely to turn their noses up at them now and say, well, I'm just learning through a screen, it doesn't count. I think people recognize that you can learn things in that way. So that, I think, is how this connects to the future of sort of workplace education and upskilling, because the clear trend is towards, it's the trend that people worry about and talk about is the machines are coming and they're going to take our jobs. That's actually not what's happening. And if you look at the forecast of how many jobs the robots are supposedly going to take, or the AIs are going to take, it's been going down. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the forecast from the World Economic Forum went negative. In other words, they finally admitted that this is going to create jobs, not destroy them. But they're different jobs and they require different skills. And that means what automation actually does is it changes people's jobs. It doesn't make them go away. And if your job changes and you need different skills, then that means that you're going to have to acquire new skills more frequently, and your old skills are going to become more perishable. And so the answer to all of that, I think, is a large part of the answer is going to be more use of online learning and online platforms. And one of the things we've seen this year is there is a lot of scope to improve them, and we're seeing a lot of innovation on the sort of tools around there. So I think that's a very fertile area where people are going to be coming up with lots of new ideas. So yeah, I think it's one of the silver linings that I would look at in what has otherwise been a very, very difficult year.
So we have a question from Anne in Virginia. Commercial real estate is a big concern in the United States after the pandemic. Is this true throughout the world? And there seems to be just such disagreement about who you talk to about whether companies are really going to leave New York, which we're seeing, or we're getting so many companies that are moving to Texas now.
Yes, no, absolutely. This
silver lining.
Yes, or Texas, TECCH, Texas, because all the Elon Musk is the latest person to move there, I hear. Yes, no, I think again, this is the reason that you hear conflicting answers is that there is no single answer. So it's not the case that all companies are going to shut down their offices and everyone's going to work from home and all the rest of it. Firstly, because most people can't work from home, but secondly, because I think the switch, I mean, a few companies are going to switch to being fully remote all the time, but I think most of them are not. What we're going to see instead, and this is again, Bill Gates has dared to make a prediction on this. He says we'll see 50% less business travel, but we'll also see about 30% more days spent working from home. And I think that's about right. So I think if you were someone who was going into the office, I probably went into the office 4 days a week and worked from home 1 day a week. And I think that will probably change to going in, going in 2 or 3 days a week and working from home 2 or 3 days a week, because we've recognized that these hybrid models are actually they're very efficient, but there are still some things we'd like to be able to do in person. So we'll go into the office for the things that we really have to do in person, and that means offices will change. There'll be less working at a desk on your own. You'll do that at home, but there'll be more going into the office to collaborate and come up with ideas and work with other people. So the kinds of spaces we're going to need are going to change. We're going to need more collaborative spaces, I think, and we are, yes, overall going to need less office space, but not that much less. If you look at forecasts at this from the big consultancies, it's typically 15 to 20% less square footage. So it's not the end of the office, but it is it's clearly a reduction. The other thing is where those offices are. So if you are Amazon, say, you might say, well, we're going to scale up, we're going to have this big new program, or Facebook is another example. If they hire you, they want you to move to the Bay Area. That's a nightmare because you end up spending your time sitting on the 101. You have to find property around there. It's very hard to find an affordable place to live, even on a Facebook salary. What they've realized with everyone working from home is that actually you don't need to be in the Bay Area. So Facebook and Amazon have both just rented lots of space in New York. And that's because they've recognized that you can have offices, and it's nice to have people in offices, but they don't need to be there all the time, and the office doesn't all need to be the same office. So they are buying while the the price is low, as it were, because they are going to still have people working in offices, maybe not all the time, but they don't all need to actually be in that single enormous It's the biggest, I think it's the biggest indoor office in the world, isn't it? It's the biggest open plan office in the world, and that enormous building in Menlo Park. So I think that's why you're seeing these sort of apparently conflicting signals that the office is over, only it's not over, and Facebook's going to let everyone work from home forever, only it's also renting office space. It's a mixed picture, and again, it's going to take a few years for this new picture to emerge, and that is going to involve some turbulence for the real estate companies. But I hope it will mean that some property can be repurposed to residential use, and I hope it also means that the pressure on the big job magnet cities like New York and San Francisco, and to a lesser extent Austin and Portland and so on, I hope it means that actually you don't need to live in one of those cities to have a good job, and that second-tier cities are more desirable places. You can get a better quality of life, and this will mean that the kind of insane property prices that we see in those big cities, it should basically become more affordable for people to live where they work, and not have to be paying quite so much in rent or mortgage payments or whatever. So I think again that's a silver lining that will take a few years to emerge.
Well, that's right. We invite everyone to come to Texas, raise our real estate prices. Lots of lots of opportunities here. Philip Coggin wrote an interesting piece talking about the workplace culture, and in a sense, he suggests that there really can be sort of a greater separation from those who are able to work at home and those who can't.
Yes, I think there's a risk in all of this with this hybrid model that I think we're moving towards. That it is going to make it harder for people earlier in their careers to network. Networking is changing. You can't just have a coffee with someone. You can't sort of bump into someone in the lift and so on. If you're going into the office 2 days a week instead of, and they're going into the office 2 days, the chances, the serendipity, the number of chance encounters is just going to be smaller because there's going to be less social mixing in the office if there's fewer people in the office. And so for people later in their careers, that's fine. They've built their professional networks. They can transfer all of that to Zoom meetings, and they've got their Rolodex full of people. But the danger is that people earlier in their careers are going to find it harder to get themselves established, and this is going to be unfair for them. So I think the onus is on companies to figure out how they are addressing that. How are they, identifying talent internally and externally? How are they reaching out to ensure that they are plugged into sources of talent? Because there's an enormous opportunity again here. If you can hire people anywhere, you can access a much larger pool of talent, and that includes people overseas. So potentially that's an enormous opportunity for really high skilled people in foreign countries who wouldn't be able to move to high wage countries very easily, but can now potentially work from those places. So there's all sorts of changes happening here, and it probably means that overpaid people in rich countries are more at risk of basically being undercut by smart people in lower wage economies. So there are going to be winners and losers to a lot of these changes, and I think a particular concern is that we just make sure that you don't have the rich get richer and the well-connected people do better, and that the next generation of leaders and the next generation of talent is left behind.
Let me bring Larry Lauer into the conversation. We have just about 2 more minutes to go. And he asks about greater misinformation in media literacy. And I'm sure that's something that you've given a lot of thought to.
Yes, no, absolutely. Media literacy as a skill is obviously something that has become increasingly important. And one of my favorite examples is teachers say, well, you can't use Wikipedia as an encyclopedia. Yes, you can, because if you use it, it forces you, because that anyone could have edited it, it forces you to say, well, what is your source for that, and where did you get that, and show me the the primary source, and it forces you to learn how to assess the credibility of sources. And I think that's a really important skill. And I think young people are good at this. They can smell, if they're being told nonsense. I think it tends to be older people who are not so good at sort of assessing that. They've grown up in a world where you can trust the newspaper and you can trust the main broadcasters, and now you can't trust everything you read on the internet or on Facebook, and they don't know quite so much how to assess that. So I think young people actually have quite a lot of skills because they're in these environments, natively, and they understand how to assess how plausible people are. But there is a societal problem here that it's much easier to spread information than it was, and we're still in the early days of grappling with that problem.
So Tom, we got last question. Is your glass half full or half empty?
Well, I think my glass. I'm inherently optimistic. I'm interested in what the future looks like. I'm interested in trying to forecast it. and I want it to be better. And some years are more depressing than others, but I'm always looking for the silver lining. That's me.
That's great. And all subscribers get a copy of The World, and it should be arriving soon in their mailbox. Is that right?
North American subscribers, we send it out. Yes, and I think some people have already received it, but yes, North American subscribers receive it as part of their subscription. It's not true everywhere in the world, but it is in the US and Canada.
Well, thank you for that. And if you're not a subscriber, you can just purchase it online.
You can buy it at shop.economist.com, and it's on newsstands as well.
Well, Tom, as I said, I've been reading that for years, and I always look forward to it, as I look forward as well to Time, Person, or Thing of the Year as well. But it's so well done. Thanks for following Daniel Franklin. It's just the quality is as good as ever, and so much appreciate the hard work that you and all your colleagues put into it. And thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been great. Thank you.
And let me remind all of our viewers that you can keep up with our programs by going to dfwworld.org, or again, do subscribe to our YouTube channel and share it on your social media. Have a great day. Thanks so much for being with us.